अगर अब कहीं जाने का सोचो, अपने हाथ से मारूंगा तुम्हें। निकाह से पहले हाथ तो लगा सकता हूँ ना। तुम्हें पता है कौन कौन ढूंढ रहा तुम्हें? सुना है अगर बेगम के पैरों को छू लो ना,
And unfortunately, dramas these days are not based on family values or love or friendship or sisterhood or any positive messaging. They are feeding off generational animosity, betrayal, revenge, murder, abuse, toxicity. These are the underlying
in this country there's a culture of taking religion and using that to sort of bring down women and bring down the idea of sort of women rights. We should I think there needs to be.
I can, to a certain extent, buy the argument that the masses want to watch, drama as close to reality as possible. So there is an appetite for certain kind of violence and violent scenes as well. But the point is that are you shooting it from the perspective of the victim, or are you shooting it to empathize with the oppressor?
Art is a very powerful medium. Art is a medium that can communicate and that can reach the people. And it allows us to have conversations which we otherwise would not have, and to have uncomfortable conversations when we do have a society where there is a culture of silence. I'm Rida Hosain, and today we're going to talk about how we have seen a troubling pattern over the course of the last few years, where dangerous stereotypes have been perpetuated in dramas and in films. And to some extent, it appears that violence against women and domestic abuse is being normalized. And in this regard, one drama which has recently sparked a conversation is titled Man Mast Malang. And the scene which has sparked conversation on social media is a scene where the male hero ties up the female lead of the film, and this is portrayed as part of the romantic arc of the show. And this has again brought to light that in some respects, our dramas do glorify and romanticize abuse. To talk about this, in the first part, we're joined by Amna Isaani, and she will tell us from her experience what her view is and whether there is such a pattern. And Amna is a journalist with over 2 decades of experience, and she also has her own digital platform. And in the second part, we'll be joined by Mohammed Jibran Nasir and Nimra Arshad, who are legal experts. And we'll talk to them about domestic violence laws in Pakistan and PEMRA's role when it comes to regulating such content. And we've talked about Man Mast Malang, but we've seen these dangerous stereotypes being perpetuated even in earlier dramas, where there is the innocent woman, the obedient woman with a man that is violent, that is aggressive, and that is angry. And the message that this sends to the audience is that this is normal behavior and it is inherent for men to react this way. Based on your experience, and because you view these dramas quite closely, do you notice a problematic trend in this regard?
Oh, absolutely. I think we've been observing this for the last few years. And it's not just a reflection of what we see in society, because, of course, violence against women is always on the rise in Pakistan. We've witnessed this today, where a young TikToker, 17-year-old TikToker, is murdered. And the victim blaming begins, and the onus always lies on the woman. So we see that reflected on television, but unfortunately, it's not done in a very responsible way. The way it's done is that it's romanticized, it's glamorized, and it's feeding into a very toxic masculine audience that justifies it and romanticizes it. And I think it's very, very damaging, especially nowadays. We've been seeing this for years now. Whether it's a woman who has agency, whether she's educated, no matter what class she's from, if she's not the obedient, if she doesn't fit that role of being the obedient, Nick girl, then she's up for, bad treatment and abuse.
And you mentioned the incident that just occurred today as well, the murder of a 17-year-old girl. And I
Yeah,
won't go into the details because the police is investigating that case, but just in terms of some of the reactions that I myself saw on social media right
absolutely.
after the murder was reported, and this was a child that was murdered, and you had people responding to the murder of a child, a 17-year-old girl, saying that शुक्र है गैरत जाग गई है
It's
और अब
horrific.
हमारी सोसाइटी को हम साफ कर रहे हैं. So this is the kind of
Horrific.
response that you have. So there is something that is clearly wrong in our society. There is something that is going clearly wrong. And one of the common responses that we see when it comes to these conversations is that the makers often say that this is the kind of content that the audience wants to see, and that's why we make this content. And we've also seen that this kind of content garners millions of views, so they sort of justify it by saying, well, this is what the audience wants us to see, what do you want us to do about it? And this completely disregards how making content which glorifies violence contributes to a culture of violence. And when we talk about feminist scholarship as well, it doesn't say that you can never show such content. The criticism is when you glorify such content. And in fact, art can be a very powerful medium to talk about issues, to talk about violence against women and how it is an endemic, but it is the manner in which those stories are communicated. And unfortunately, we have seen that this is repeatedly romanticized. And this all too common mantra that we hear of, boys will be boys, men will be men. It allows men to assume that their actions are actually inherent to their gender rather than a set of violent actions which are then perpetuated. Do you think that the makers of these dramas have a responsibility? And if you do think that they have a responsibility, how do you think break this cycle that is currently on?
No, of course they need to have responsibility because they're a mass medium. They're influencing millions of people who are watching. I think Pakistani drama is an extremely, extremely powerful tool. But what they're doing with their responsibility is when they say that we are giving the audience what it wants to watch, a majority of the audience in Pakistan, unfortunately, also wants to watch pornography. Are you going to give that to them on television? You can't. But what are you doing now? I think we're we're also tethering towards it because you mentioned Manmas Malang. Last week, the male lead, he tied her up in ropes. This week, he handcuffed her. So we've progressed from a rope to a handcuff. And we're being told that, oh, this is romantic because the lead loves her and she also loves him. So this is all right. But what they don't understand is they're also feeding a largely illiterate population that all they're seeing is that, oh, a man is dominant over a woman and, he can see he loves her and get away with anything. And that's the tone they're setting in all these dramas. And unfortunately, dramas these days are not based on family values or love or friendship or sisterhood or any positive messaging. They are feeding off generational animosity, betrayal, revenge, murder, abuse, toxicity. These are the underlying themes for almost every single drama. And they're very, very dangerous trends that we're watching these days.
And right before, coming on this, I was also researching on what PEMRA had done and, the kind of action that had been taken by PEMRA. And I found that in 2021, PEMRA issued a directive in which they said that hug scenes should not be shown and that television channels should refrain from showing hug scenes on TV. And they issued a very detailed directive in this regard as to what the television channels should do. And so when it comes to showing intimacy on screen, we see PEMRA taking very prompt action. But when it comes to violence on screen, you don't see the same response from PEMRA. What is your view about how a responsible media should react, how a responsible regulator that is clearly seeing that this kind of content is being shown, but in this regard is largely being silent when it comes to glorifying abuse?
So I think PEMRA has issued an ordinance where you can't show blood on the screen. So the effect of that is that every bloody scene is put out in black and white. So that's disturbing as well. But yeah, they don't regulate intimacy. I mean, they do regulate intimacy, and anything that is affectionate is problematic. They're responding to the letters they get. I don't think they have any clear-cut policy They're responding to the letters they get, and we, as a nation, we are really sort of challenged by intimacy or love if it's done in a positive way. That goes down as fahashi, and uh, this they don't see as problematic. And I can only say that we're a very toxic nation that is sort of heralded by toxic men. That's what we see on the news. That's what we see in the dramas. These are the heroes that we sort of welcome and herald and celebrate. And that's what you're seeing reflected. I don't know what PEMRA is on, but they really need to. And we've spoken about this endlessly. That, gun violence is all right on television, murder is all right. The slap that we've been seeing, women getting slapped around on screen, we've been talking about it so much that now I think directors are not showing direct slaps upon women. They mime them or they take the camera away and they're not showing it up front because of the noise that we made. That please stop normalizing girls getting slapped by men. But PEMRA did nothing about that. Absolutely. So they really need to rethink their principles.
Absolutely, that we see that the regulator, even when it comes to political censorship or taking action, we have a very active regulator
Absolutely.
when it
Yeah.
comes to censoring people, whether that's their political views, whether that's what they qualify as decency and upholding the values of society. But when it comes to women and when it comes to violence against women, we don't see the same response from the regulator, and there has to be pushback against that. You talk about these dramas and the gender roles that they perpetuate, and what is the kind of pushback that you face from society, from your audience, and as well as from members within your profession when you talk about this? Because you have beat writers, beat producers who have this certain mindset. So when there is pushback from voices within the industry from about content which is glorifying the abuse, how is that received with?
So, audience is pretty much okay with it because I have to say that at Something Hot, we have a very educated audience. So they're completely in line with what we say and how we review these dramas. Whereas when it comes to directors and producers, they all come back with personal stories of how a script was changed to sort of fall into the popular narrative, or how the director changed it, or how the producers changed it. Nobody really takes responsibility. And that's been going around. It's a circle, it's a vicious cycle that goes on and on, that you blame any one person and they'll blame the next person. And of course, the easiest discourse is that this is what people want to watch. And I really disagree with that, because a drama like Kabhi Main Kabhi Tum that we saw last year didn't have toxic masculinity. And about a relationship between a man and his wife in a very positive way. And it was celebrated, it was welcomed, it got the ratings, it was on trending. So I disagree with that. It's just that it's easy to sensationalize toxicity because it gives people some weird kind of excitement, which I also understand. And I also believe that what they're making has to be a reflection of what is actually happening in society, but it needs to be done in a very responsible way. If you're talking about abuse or assault or marital rape, it needs to be done with a sense of responsibility, which is grossly lacking in these dramas. Everything is introduced in a drama, a theme is introduced through sensationalize a scene. Yeah, what do you do about that?
And I think that there is a thin line, when you talk about domestic abuse, marital rape, issues like this, talk about them, because it does break the taboo which is there in our society where we don't even talk about these issues.
Absolutely.
So there
Absolutely.
has to be a conversation around this, and art can often start those conversations, but don't glorify it, don't normalize it. And I think that's where we get the balance wrong. And there've also been a lot of studies that, when young people watch this kind of content, they get influenced by this content, and they get influenced in particular by the fact that this is acceptable behavior, that if this is what is being shown on screen, if this
Yeah.
is how male heroes are acting, if this is how celebrities that they look up to are acting, this is normal behavior, this is acceptable behavior, and this is how they can also act in real life. And there is that impression that art also has on real life and on real life decisions. So, how do you look at that in terms of the responsibility, particularly in light of the fact that we have a very young population and we have a lot of young boys watching these dramas, young girls watching these dramas, who will learn to think that this is what we should accept, that violence is love and anger is love, and this is how men show love, and this is what romance is. So, how do you think the responsibility increases when you have a young population, a young audience that is watching these dramas?
It's not just that they're romanticizing these issues, it's also that they're blaming the girl. I think it's one level even deeper into blaming the woman, making it even more intolerant for women. They're not just romanticizing it, they're blaming the woman. If the woman has a voice and she wants to work, she will get slapped. And that's okay because, her responsibility is to stay at home and take care of the child. We see this narrative over and over again in dramas that, oh, the upbringing isn't right because you weren't at home and you weren't giving your children ethical training. The father's job is to earn and bring home the bread and butter. What are you doing with your life? The way women dress is a big issue in dramas. There are so many stereotypes that any girl who's got a red lipstick, who's got a red lip color, who's wearing Western wear, who is working, will be the vixen, she will be the vamp, she will be the homebreaker. And a drama that we're watching these days, Dastak, which has a really good story about how a divorced woman comes into her own and self-discovery and she finds love again. That's a great side to it. But then you have another woman who has her curls and blonde hair and she's in high heels and she's a homebreaker. Why can't she just be a woman in love? They have to draw that line that so it's not just romanticizing. You're also putting women in boxes and saying that this kind of a woman will be the homebreaker. She will be the vixen. She will be the third woman, the seductress, the siren. And the one with the dupatta and the one who's sitting at home making the roti, taking care of her mother-in-law who's abusive, taking off her husband's feet who is abusive, she is the one who you need to listen to. So, I mean, I can go on and on about this. Yeah.
You
It's
know,
like,
it's interesting that you mention victim blaming because that is something that is now so entrenched in our society
absolutely,
at every
absolutely.
level. I remember in 2020, after the motorway rape incident, the one of
Yes.
the things that the CCPO at the time said that, why did she think she was in France?
Why
Or,
did you go out at
why
night?
did she go out at that time at night? And so
Mm.
we immediately, as a society, we start questioning the actions of the victim. And this is something that I also recently spoke about. Even if we see, Noor Mukaddam's case, they upheld the death sentence of her murderer for murder. But at the same time, throughout the course of the proceedings, we had certain comments from judges which were questioning her behavior. So from
Immediately.
the police, from a judicial level, they are questioning the actions of the victims rather than the perpetrators of the crime. This is what we're seeing on screen. This is what we're seeing in our judicial system at the police level. And this will also discourage victims from coming forward and from even reporting these kind of cases that happen to them because they'll be told that, if this is normal on television, why should I even go and report it? So we have a culture that tells victims to be silent and that rewards silence and obedience from victims that experience this kind of criminal conduct. In terms of reform and going forward, how do you think that we can break this cycle and move towards dramas that are more responsible and more responsible content on our television screens, because we do have talented actors and actresses and we do have progressive voices within the entertainment industry as well that are now speaking up against certain stereotypes. But how do you see reform and the way forward in terms of breaking this cycle where we're seeing the same stories again and again? And it's not just a one off. We talked about Man Mast Malang. It's not a one off, it's a
No, no.
pattern that happens again and again and again, the same storylines. So, how would you advocate for reform?
I think we need some very brave people to bring reform into the television industry. And we've seen that happening as well. I have to say that Sultana Siddiqui, she came up with a series that addressed mob violence. And it was a four-part series, and they were very, very constructive dramas, very progressive. Your female protagonists were strong working women, and all four of those dramas within that series targeted mob violence. And the last one was heartbreaking because, you saw what actually happens. And so these things are happening. Whenever Roshane Zafar, under Kash Foundation, she picks up a subject, she does come up with progressive storytelling, which we saw in a drama like Zard Patton Ka Ban last year, when this young girl living in a village wants to be a doctor. And how she works against odds to get there, and how her father supports her against four brothers who are toxic and say that, "Nee, marry her off and, end it." So we do see it sporadically every now and then. There just needs to be more of it. There is more Man Mas Malang happening on television than there is an Udari or a Zat Patton Ka Ban or Tan Man Neelo Neel, which was the last one we saw. I do think there are responsible actors in the industry who are making responsible choices, like you have a Sabah Kamar. You'll never see her in a regressive role, usually, or a Sajjal Ali. These are people who are taking on responsible roles. They are careful about editing their characters according to how we want women portrayed on television, not as how the average toxic male in Pakistan, and there are so many of them, would want to see women. So that is happening, but it's very far and few, and we would like to see more of it. So, like I said, we need some very brave producers, brave directors who are going to make those changes, maybe take a cut to the profit, because it's not going to be a popular drama. It's not going to be a Man Mas Malang or a Sher or a Dine, which is, playing on your sensationalism, but it needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Amna, for your time and for enlightening us about how these stereotypes are perpetuated in dramas, but also telling us that it's not all bad and that there is content in which there is pushback within the industry and that there are voices within the industry which are pushing for more responsible content. And we just hope that the balance shifts the other way sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
We've just had Amna Isaani tell us about how violence against women is being normalized in dramas, how this is not a one-off, it's not just one drama, it's not just one scene. It is a pattern and it is repeated and it happens again and again and again. And feeble justifications are given about how this is what the audience wants to see, and there is an utter disregard for how content like this contributes to a culture of violence and a culture that blames the woman and only accepts women that are obedient as acceptable. And there is dangerous stereotypes which are continuously perpetuated through our dramas and through. And when instances of abuse occur, often in the public, it is advocated that there should be harsher punishments. And harsher punishments are the solution, and that is how we will tackle violence against women. But this firstly fails to deal with the fact that there is a culture that normalizes, glorifies, romanticizes abuse. And secondly, it fails to deal with the systemic shortcomings that are within our system. As per a report by the National Commission on Human Rights, 90% of women in Pakistan experienced some form of domestic abuse in their lifetime. There was a similar report by the United Nations in which they stated that 70 to 90% of women in Pakistan experienced some form of physical or psychological abuse by their partner. And violence against women and domestic violence in Pakistan is an endemic, and it is time that we call it what it is. Jibran Sahib, if I can start with you. In Sindh, we have a law which is the Sindh Prevention and Protection Against Domestic Violence Law. And this law also criminalizes domestic violence expressly. Physical violence, psychological violence, economic abuse is also covered within the law. But there is still a culture that accepts this as normal. We are still told when victims of domestic violence go to the police station that this is a private matter. Yeah, zati mamla hai. Why are you in the courts? And there is still this culture that normalizes it. In your view, does the law go far enough, or does the issue lie within society and within a culture that is normalizing and justifying this?
Vikim, I don't necessarily believe that law can give you values. I think laws either recognize your existing values or they represent values you aspire for as a society. Now, this is also a consideration that when laws are made, they are primarily being made by a representative class, which also happens to be an economically affluent and elite class, and for all purposes, detached from the masses and especially their miseries and miseries which take place amongst their household. Drafting a law, having a discussion in the parliament is one thing, and enacting is another thing. But making sure that it's understanding and what you're trying to achieve through it trickles down not through the masses and society, that not only do they become aware of their right vis-a-vis women and aware of their responsibilities, other members of the household who subject women to violence, it is also important that whether your law enforcement agencies and members of your judiciary who are supposed to ensure the enforcement of this enactment, are as sensitized and are sharing these values not as a matter of personal prerogative, but as a national value which is supposed to be upheld as a legal duty. So we have also seen that the Sindh High Court, for example, has in some instances been at pains to directly address magistrates and plead to them that your duty is not just to simply wipe off the tears of the victim of domestic violence, but your duty is also to timely ensure that given that her dignity is inviolable, that she is secure, restored to her original premises, that she is provided immediate protection, and that she does not continue to live for even another moment under any kind of fear or inhibitions vis-a-vis her own personal security. So we see, and this is not just in matters of domestic violence, many other kinds of violence which are perpetuated against women. For example, the case of child brides, child marriage itself. We see lack of sensitization amongst the police and members of judiciary. Also in terms of cases involving child sexual abuse under 377A, or for that matter, rape. We are a society which largely accepts, I mean, if tomorrow Gallup is supposed to go out and conduct a survey, I think we will all be, well, I won't say shocked, but definitely frightened to realize it that a massive part, substantial part of a society accepts a presence of a nikanama as a legitimate defense to cohabitate and take to bed a 13-year-old, primarily on the evidence that she has achieved physical puberty. And without going into the merits of the case at how well informed she is about the decisions she's being taken or she's being made to take. So yes, it's a problem which exists, and I don't think our parliamentarians have done to address that. I believe the parliamentarians have, vis-a-vis these laws which relate to human rights, for most part played to the European gallery, where certain sanctions could be imposed to us if we do not improve our legal schemes. But are they really, translating into real numbers and making an improvement on ground? I think that remains to be seen.
Absolutely. I think there is a huge gap between the law and the implementation of the law. And recently, even if we saw the child marriage restraint bill at the federal level in Islamabad, there was a lot of opposition, especially even from the Council of Islamic Ideology, which was saying that it shouldn't be passed and they should be allowed to give their support. So we do see continued resistance against laws which relate to violence against women, which relate to violence against children as well. Nimra, if I can ask you about the law in Punjab. The law in Punjab differs from the law in Sindh insofar as it does not in express terms criminalize domestic violence. The offenses that exist in the Pakistan Penal Code, they are there, of course, but it does not, like the law in Sindh, specifically criminalize domestic violence. It gives civil remedies in the form of a protection order or a monetary order, which the court can give, and it does not go as far as the laws in the other provinces go. And in this regard, the law in Punjab was also challenged in the federal Shariat court. And over there, one of the oppositions to the law which was taken was that women who are married should not be allowed to take their husbands to court, and allowing women that are married to take their husbands to court will devastate our family system. And in a judgment, the federal Shariat court rejected all such submissions against the law and upheld the law and said that it is in accordance with Islam and that Islam gives women the right to access justice. But do you think that the law in Punjab falls short insofar that it does not go as far as other laws in criminalizing expressly domestic violence?
Oh, I think, Rilla, you've hit the nail on the head. We've identified that it's a law that doesn't criminalize domestic violence, and Punjab sort of continues to rely on the provisions of the PPC as far as domestic violence is concerned. But I think there are certain good elements to the law as well, which I think can be replicated on a national model as well, which is, I think, and so actually, like, before we sort of begin and get into the law itself, one thing that I think is a real cause of concern is that currently the law, in terms of its implementation, is just restricted to Multan Jugra, and it is yet to be notified for the rest of the province as well. But for Multan, we've seen that there has been some significant success in terms of what the law has been able to achieve in that jurisdiction. So what the law envisages is this one-stop shop model where they've set up this violence against women center, which is supposed to work as this facilitation center for women who may come in with a complaint of domestic abuse or physical violence, where they have access to police personnel, where they have access to medical personnel, legal aid, psychological support, and then of course a shelter home, and they're able to access all these resources to sort of, to be able to get out of a situation that is possibly threatening their life, or other sorts of harm that may come to them. So that, and I think this is something that the Federal Shariat Court also identified in its judgment, that I think the judgment, when it came out, I think the number that they quoted was that that center had taken care of about 8,000 complaints in that just one district. So if we extrapolate that number to the whole of Punjab, we're looking at possible cases of domestic violence that would go into hundreds of thousands. And this is also 8,000 cases that were just reported there. For every one case that's reported, there are possibly 10 cases that are not reported. So just in terms of, the numbers of cases that we have of domestic violence, as you said, about 90% of women in Pakistan go through some form of domestic violence. So this element, this idea, the core idea of this law of having, having this one sort of stop shop, one physical place which women can access for all these support services, I think that's a really good starting point, and that's a model that needs to be replicated first throughout Punjab and then, of course, nationally. But you're absolutely right that the law falls short in terms of not criminalizing the offense of domestic abuse. We've seen in Punjab that a lot of women, there is a distinct culture of women not being able to access these avenues of justice. We've seen there's a distinct culture, as Jibran Sahab rightly pointed out, of women not being able to access courts, of women not being able to, or women not being able to essentially, they're being discouraged to essentially approach these avenues of justice. And by not necessarily having a specific legislation in place, I think that also, for example, with the Sindh law, there are district protection committees that are available throughout the province that women can access, and then which are specifically designed to deal with these complaints. But because we don't have facilities like this in Punjab, that adds, there is a distinct culture just in terms of being able to access avenues of justice, going to courts, going to police stations. And then, we've spoken about like societal values and how these ideas of, domestic abuse or marital rape, firstly, they're not recognized within our familial structures. And even if they are, there's a level of sort of hesitation about bringing this into the public. And then just briefly touching on the Federal Shariat Court judgment about this law, I think that's one of the most sort of categorical judgments that I've read in terms of, what the Federal Shariat Court said in that judgment, where they said that, in fact, this law in itself upholds Islamic values, and Islamic values about marriage, when marriage is based on, the sort of elements of empathy and compassion and love for your partner. So I think that judgment, I think, wasn't necessarily as well publicized as it should have been. We should have, because in this country, there's a culture of taking religion and using that to sort of, bring down women and bring down the idea of sort of women rights. I think there needs to be more publication of that judgment and what that judgment said about women in marriage and the rights of women in marriage.
No, absolutely. That was a really good and a progressive judgment. And one of the points raised in that judgment was, this is a law for protection of women, so actually you're discriminating against men. And the Federal Shariat Court also rejected that and says that the Constitution of Pakistan allows the state to take affirmative action and positively discriminate in favor of women and children. Jibran Sahab, in the previous segment, we were also talking about PEMRA and the role of the regulator. And in this regard, in 2021, PEMRA issued a regulation and a directive in which they said that hug scenes or scenes in which hugging is shown should not be shown on television screens. So when it comes to intimacy and regulating intimacy on screen, we've seen PEMRA adopt a proactive approach. But when it comes to violence against women and glorifying violence in dramas and in film, we don't see the same kind of response from PEMRA. And in this regard, there's also a judgment from the Supreme Court in 2023 where they warned and they said, we're not saying that content should be censored, but there is a thin line, and there's a thin line between showing content and glorifying content. So are you showing content in a way where you are condemning it, or are you showing it in a way where you are normalizing it? What do you think is the role of the regulator when we are seeing drama after drama, violence against women?
Before I address this question of yours, just to touch upon what Nimra very rightly pointed out, that The Federal Shariat Court often comes up with some really good and well-reasoned judgments on legislations which relate to protection of women and child and to any opposition against such pieces of legislation. We have seen similar reasoned judgments regarding the Punjab and the Sindh child marriage laws as well, where the Federal Shariat Court upheld them. The question remains when such reasoning is present and is present within Islam, and we do realize that whether we like it or not, religion and state and our way of life in Pakistan is intertwined. Why doesn't this discussion takes place at the time when you are seeking enactment through parliament? Why doesn't the parliament and the representative governments make it a point to actually publicize these values? Because there's also a distinction we need to draw. Spirituality within religion, I believe, could be a matter of personal interpretation of how you seek redemption and how you seek your connection with God. But as far as our rights are concerned, our way of life is concerned, I think given that we are an Islamic Republic, there has to be some authority, and we cannot have every single sect, and within every single sect, people referring to different authorities who are sitting in our mosques, who are sitting at madrasas, and we take our personal matters to them and we seek their consensus or consent to how we, conduct our domestic and personal affairs, as opposed to what the law is saying. So we will find many people who will be giving decrees that some sort of violence is allowed and permissible in certain circumstances against women. Now, coming and addressing your issues regarding PEMRA. PEMRA, within its code of conduct, which came about in 2015, refers to the word or mentions the word violence multiple times and specifically restricts, as a matter of fundamental principle and as a direction to the license operators as well, that you cannot glamorize violence. And I believe that's where the problem is, that our failure in recognizing and identifying the parameters of what constitutes as glamorizing violence. I can, to a certain extent, buy the argument that the masses want to watch, drama as close to reality as possible. So there is an appetite for certain kind of violence and violent scenes as well. But the point is that are you shooting it from the perspective of the victim, or are you shooting it to empathize with the oppressor? And trying to say that, hey, let's, for example, were talking about the movie Animal before we joined, and in that you are trying to actually stage that why does this protagonist has this state of mind? This is what has gone into his upbringing, and hence, if he has outbursts of violence where he goes and kills people left, right, and center, including his own family members, this is the rationale behind it. So we are taking into that isolated world where that we justify the existence, the presence, and perhaps even the need of such kind of violence. Now, that's one perspective where you are perhaps not giving the right kind of message to your audiences. And there is another perspective that perhaps you're depicting the story of a victim, that she or him or whoever, against very tough circumstances, against very kind of brutal oppression, still had the courage to, go and seek redemption and seek justice and hold the oppressors accountable. So showing violence is one thing from the perspective we're showing it, and of course, when it's through a drama and not a news story, a lot of things go into it. The context of the story, the camera angles, the lighting, the background music. You can communicate whether you're condemning this violence, whether you're justifying this violence, or you're glamorizing this violence through all of that. And I believe for that, it is also a big question, concerning question, that the Council of Complaints, which is primarily the adjudicating body over these matters, for most part of the years, we find them absent, not notified at all for many different provinces and cities. So that often issue becomes a concern. And secondly, when they are appointed, their own sensitivity and understanding of the arts and news media, and whether they can be as nuanced in this or not. So I don't think that there could be a blanket ban on showing any kind of violence, because that would be fiction. Nobody would be able to justify, and directors and perhaps storytellers would not be able to make the point come across. But yes, glamorizing the violence, that is an issue. And isme main, just want to add one point. We've often seen that PEMRA takes a very proactive and almost exercises suo moto powers when we're talking about a romantic scene, as opposed to a scene where some kind of sexual violence is being forced upon a woman, where there we are, we are all up in arms. So kind of one makes it think that, scenes or stories which depict women also have consent, and their consent is important, and they can realize their consent, materialize their consent, and act accordingly. With that part is, with that notion is part of the journal romantic story, I believe that is condemned. But where you're showing one-sided violence, even if it's sexual in nature, PEMRA does not take much issue with that.
We have a regulator that regulates intimacy, but that has not regulated cases where violence has been glorified against women. Nimra, if I can ask you the same thing, I absolutely agree with what Jibran Sahib has said, that there is a difference between showing violence and glorifying violence, because art is a very powerful medium. Art is a medium that can communicate and that can reach the people, and it allows us to have conversations which we otherwise would not have, and to have uncomfortable conversations when we do have a society where there is a culture of silence. So, of course, we would want to see art where they are talking about stories, about human stories of violence against women, but doing it in a manner that is sensitive and doing it in a manner that does not glorify it. How do you see the role of the regulator? And how do you think that other jurisdictions deal with these issues? Because as Jibran Saab mentioned, this has also happened in India, where we've seen content coming like this, and even in Hollywood and other entertainment industries, there has been a rise in this kind of content.
So, two things. Firstly, I think if we talk about other jurisdictions, I think the starting point has to be that there needs to be a bare minimum of regulation, right? So, for example, in the US, you have the Federal Communications Commission, which doesn't, as a matter of law, regulate content beyond what is, unprotected by the First Amendment, or what falls under the indecency rule, which is essentially anything that is considered obscene or vulgar. Similarly, in the UK, you have Ofcom, which again is the regulator for all broadcast material. It's the way how you approach then regulation itself, whether it is necessarily almost a suo moto process where you're coming down hard, or you're having a very reactionary approach to something that, somebody said something on social media and immediately the regulator is like, we're going to ban it. Or you have a more democratic approach. Now, for example, if we look at the law and the Council of Complaints, essentially the idea is, this was something that was held by the Supreme Court, a judgment that you also just referred to, the 2023 judgment, that PEMRA, as the authority, unilaterally cannot ban content. Anything that it bans or anything that has to be taken off air needs to go through the Council of Complaints, which again is supposed to be made up of 5 individuals, 2 of whom are supposed to be women. And the idea being that at all times that body needs to be represented by a diverse set of group of people who have to be women belonging to different fields, human rights, law. So the idea that different people from diverse set of background needs to look at the content which might be under complaint, and then essentially come up with an objective view and see whether that passes the test of sort of obscenity, vulgarity, or sort of the common standard of decency, I think, is the phrase that's used in the law. While I am a big proponent that this our approach of banning everything is, I think it's a very it's a counterproductive approach. But you can't have. I don't also believe in the idea of no regulation at all. So that process has to be there needs to be due process into how we go about or how we go about sort of judging content of what is good or what is not good. So for that, we need to have an effective Council of Complaints that is functioning at all times, that is also addressing complaints and resolving complaints at a steady pace. I was, just before coming on here, I was looking at the Council Complaints, the list of sort of complaints that sort of are right now pending before them. And a majority chunk of the complaints are generally, are just essentially of content that's apparently vulgar, obscene, or, against the values of Islam, which is all okay. But then we also need to develop necessarily standards and define standards that are ever evolving and then respond to needs of time as well, because there can't be a content also evolves with time and it changes with time. So there can't be hard and fast rules of, a hug is, we're not going to show a hug, but, it's okay for us to show this. So that's one bit. The second idea of us, and I think this is something that sort of is the earlier part of the conversation, essentially, of how we sort of depict content. So, for example, I think in a recent sort of drama, it's called Karze Jaan, the idea, this male antagonist was, he ended up, he raped somebody, he murdered somebody. But the last episode, the last 20 minutes were given to him. He had a 20-minute monologue, basically just allowing him to sort of humanize himself and justify why he did what he did. If that drama, and so in those last 20 minutes, like I personally saw tweets were saying, we feel sorry for him. So that's in a way when we start depicting a rapist and a murderer in a way that people then start feeling sorry for them. That's where we need to draw a line. That's where we need to draw a line that this is, and then this is something that also cannot come from regulation. This is something that needs to come from the artists themselves. This needs to come from the writers themselves, the producers, the directors, that how we're showing these individuals, how we are depicting our stories, that this story of rape and murder ended on a note where people were left empathizing with the rapist and a murderer. That's where we need to sort of switch the lens, as Jibran Sahab rightly pointed out, where that drama ends on a note where that person is villainized and not left in a way that, people empathize with them. So it's all about the lens, but while a certain level of regulation needs to exist, I think the more regulation needs to come from the industry itself, from the artists themselves, and from the viewer also. The viewer itself needs to actively object to what they're seeing on screen. I think the stories, while, we're talking, while keeping aside violence on one side, when we just this idea of the male character being, the rude, angry male, alpha male, toxic, the way we've romanticized this character and the way we've built them up, that is something that we actively need to work against. There are certain, and this is not a problem that just on TV. This is also a problem that I've noticed on sort of fiction that's coming out of Pakistan. So there is, and female digests, for example, and I'll just quickly wrap up in 30 seconds. Female digests are something that is very popular among women, very popular among women. And I was just doing some research on these websites. If you go, which have these stories, there are sections, there are certain genres which, so there is a genre for forced marriage, there is a genre for Khoon Baha based novels, where at the end of all these novels, the man apparently, gets for like 45 pages, he's the most egoistical, subjecting violence, rude man. But in the last page, he is essentially, he turns over a new leaf and he becomes a decent human being. So that kind of content, when that's proliferated among society, amongst men and women both, we normalize it. That's something that we actively all need to work against.
Thank you both so much for your time. I think that, we've established that violence against women, against children in Pakistan, it is an endemic. It's important for us to talk about it. And it's important for us to say that this content that, like we've talked about today in the episode, content that we've identified, it is not acceptable to glamorize violence. It is not acceptable to romanticize violence. And as Nimra says, there is an onus on the artists as well that are also becoming involved in projects like this to raise questions, for the audience to raise questions, and for us as civil society lawyers to raise questions about what it is that we are showing on screen and what it is that we are normalizing for young people in our society. And we hope that conversations like this and identifying these harmful stereotypes will pave the way for change. Thank you both so much.